So we have the man of the hour. We have Matt from CBRE, Matt Madden. How are you?
I'm good, Jenny. How are you?
So we're going to focus on Singapore. Obviously, it's an international hub, but there are some people saying that it might lose its status because of this 3-year moratorium that it places. But, do you think that the moratorium has really ended?
Well, data center prices in Singapore are the highest in the world. So as an investment opportunity, if you own a data center, you've got 95% full data center, you've got full pricing. So from an investment criteria, it's actually pretty good. But as a central hub, will it lose its shine? I don't think so. I think the subsea cable systems that come into Singapore,
they have a 60 megawatt cap per year, and you have to get permission for greener practices to build new facilities. That's not really good news. Is really that the end of the moratorium?
I think they just announced 80 megawatts. Is that right? So there was 4 winners. Microsoft won, AirTrunk and ByteDance, GDS and Equinix. And I think 80 megawatts they've handed out there. So I think what you're seeing is you've still got a high processing power in Singapore. The hunger for growth and power consumption is huge. But I think the way that the government has responded in a very responsible way, focusing on environment, focusing on the limited resources in Singapore. So I think it will continue to be a primary centre. Absolutely.
And industry experts say, but there has more to be done in terms of regulation and an actual practice of advanced technology for sustainable practices. There's all these sustainable practices thrown around. We've been heard about cooling, liquefied cooling, immersion technology, a rooftop over our heads on DC campuses. That's all great, but investment-wise, I know you're the guy of the deal. Being realistic, is that going to work? I mean, I know Singapore is going big on hydrogen. Yep. What's your way on this?
I don't really have a view in terms of a hydrogen view, but I can say to you that from an investment perspective, you've got some fundamentals that you have to go through. One constant in data centers is they always want more power. So there's always more computing, there's always more requirement to add that power. And I think AI is going to really start to step that up. So if I'm looking at it, what is the regulations that need to change? Well, how about we run servers at a higher temperature? In doing it 1 degree in temperature can have an impact of 2 to 5% on the cost of cooling. So that additional power can be utilized into the data center. So creating those efficiencies, forcing the industry to change is something that needs to happen.
You said artificial intelligence. That is the buzzword. I know you're catching up on that. But, some say ChatGPT, OpenAI, all these technologies, although there's a hype around it, when you're applying that to the actual data center operation and the automation, it has a long way to go. Do you agree with that? And, if data center operators want to move on the bandwagon, join the bandwagon, what do they have to do to incorporate that? Is it going to have a major change in the existing technologies and the infrastructure they have right now?
Yeah, so if you're looking at AI, and we sort of looked at AI as a book, we're in the introduction of the book, right? So we're reading the first page in the book. There's a long way to go before we start to see that as a mainstream type activity, but there is significant investment going in there, significant design changes, and the cooling requirements cannot be done via traditional methods of air distribution. It has to be to the rack to cool it. So therefore that makes it a more efficient data center.
Then coming back to our topic of Singapore, where does Singapore stay in all this hype of AI and automation? Because you just said that they might not have hydrogen as to power the DC facilities, but they can use hydrogen to probably generate electricity for DC centers.
For sure.
But for industry leaders, when is that happening? By 2030? Do you see improvements?
I think let's take a step out over the next 5 years and see what happens, right? So I think we're not there yet, but if you can improve the efficiency in the existing base of data centers, so improving that PUE and moving the needle on that has a marked impact on adding additional capacity into the data center market. So I think that's a first step, and that's certainly something the Singapore government is signalling to the rest of the market, which is great.
So what would a success story look like for Singapore? I know in other European nations, they can use like cold weather to cool their systems naturally.
Sure.
But Singapore, there's a lot of attractive factors that appeal, but one of them is not the humidity or high temperatures.
No.
So, but if we have a success story in Singapore, it would likely impact other countries as well. So what do you vision as the future of Singapore in a very successful story of putting automation in sustainable practices?
So I think if they can get the PUE rates down across the board in Singapore, they automatically free up some capacity that's just being used to cool the additional racks. If we can get into closed loop cooling, i.e. water cooling to the rack directly, then we don't need to have fans blowing air around everywhere. So those are the types of things that I think Singapore is just working on right now in its tropical data center with the university. Those things will make a marked difference. You have to plan ahead. You can't sort of think about today's problem. You've got to be thinking about tomorrow's problem as well.
Speaking of problems, there are neighboring countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, that are trying to step up their game. They say that economic woes in Singapore is kind of boon for other countries because then they could be much appeal for DC facilitation. Do you think, what does Singapore have to do? What's the strategic move for DC operators that have both facilities in both places to try to have a coherent strategy for growth?
So the interesting part about this part of the world versus other parts of the world is the fact that you have basically 6 hyperscalers. You have three from America and 3 from China. Those hyperscalers are driving that market growth. So they're pushing that along. So yes, there is some co-location activities, but we're going to be moving more and more and more of that compute into cloud. So if I look around, what's Singapore's strategic advantage? Like it's the shipping capital of Southeast Asia, it's the communications capital or the data capital of Southeast Asia as well. So it has a really strong part to play. Long way to go before we start to see major issues. Yes, it's good for neighbouring countries to pop up and start to grow because we know that those GDPs growing with the infrastructure will make a big difference for them and make a big difference for Singapore.
So I'm going to go into a little bit hard question. I know as if it wasn't hard enough,
Yeah, I'm sweating.
So geopolitical tensions, you mentioned 3 from the West, 3 in China.
Yep.
You know the digital tech war brewing between those 2 biggest economies,
Sure.
and it's affecting the global supply chain from Northeast to Southeast Asia. And Singapore is in the middle of it. It's booming in terms of international business. They can't just shy away from the US or Western countries, and they can't shy away from Huawei in China. So what is their advantage, or other intermediary countries that are seeking collaboration in tech, but geopolitical tensions are making headwinds for anyone who's trying to grow business? What's your recommendation in weathering this storm?
So, the huge topic there, a lot of questions to unpack, but if I just sort of start with one, that geopolitical sort of viewpoint, in Europe we have Switzerland, right? In Southeast Asia we have Singapore.
Switzerland is no longer Switzerland anymore with Ukraine, you know that.
Oh, let's just play with that for a little minute, right? So if you think about that impact, the fact that you've got, 27 subsea cables, 21 that land in Singapore and then disperse to all parts of Asia and Europe and the US, you've got the perfect opportunity to continue to be that market for the other economies. So I think Singapore plays an incredibly strong point there.
So if one sign doesn't work out, you have the other. That's what you're saying.
Correct. You've got 6, right? And in the US, you don't have 6, you have 3.
But how do we know we picked the right side?
Well, you've picked 6, so you've got 6, you've got more to choose.
If you choose one, you can't rescind it, can you?
No, and I think the reality is that the battle is for the IT of the economy. So yes, that's one part. There's the battle for AI, which is the other part that's coming. That wave is coming, and China's making some very heavy investments in there. So I think the next wave of infrastructure and growth and drive into the data center industry is certainly going to come from AI.
So for Singapore, what would you advise? If Singapore came to you saying, we have to pick a side, where should we
Don't pick a side. I think the opportunity is to be that provider to all. And I think Singapore is uniquely positioned to do that.
You mentioned undersea cables. You know, there are a lot of headwinds over there, and undersea cable, it fuels internet connectivity. And Singapore, although it's not a powerhouse, it does follow the trends. Japan is one of the biggest houses. It's connecting with Europe as well.
Yeah.
So where does Singapore go in terms of undersea cables? And what's their strategy? And how does that tie to data center operators? I know this is a big question.
So the way it ties is that information has to move around the globe. So subsea cables, like shipping lanes, follow the same paths. So it's the shortest route. Singapore provides the shortest route to all parts of other locations around the globe. You've certainly got, if you just go and have a look at countries with large amounts of subsea cables and how many data centers they have, you'll see that they're directly correlated. So the data's got to get somewhere, it's got to be housed somewhere, and it's got to be distributed. The subsea cable is kind of like the highway, and the data center is the destination.
So a similar question is, how does Singapore trap investments that are escaping to other neighboring countries?
You don't. You just don't trap them at all. You just enable them to be more. The more that Singapore has that impact of enabling those other countries and those other GDPs, the faster that they will grow. We've seen that the GDP is that broadband growth and the impact of broadband has a direct impact on the GDP of a country. In fact, it can turn the needle by 1.5%. So getting the other countries around Southeast Asia into a more productive state will only go towards benefiting Singapore in the long term as well. So I think Singapore should see itself in a very prime position.
We are in Singapore right now, and you've been following the conversations around this floor. So what was the most impressive? This is your personal intake. This is the last question to wrap it up. What you didn't hear last year?
Well, I think there's a lot more people here. I think there's definitely a lot more of a buzz coming from the industry as we shake off that COVID cold. So for me, what I'm seeing is the excitement that's being generated around the region. I'm also going to say thank goodness that we've made an announcement on 4 new data centres in Singapore. I think that's great. I think the industry has been dying to see some form of outcome from that. But I think most importantly for the industry is that there's a leadership position that the Singapore government is actually taking on climate, on the impact of data centres, on limited resources. We live on a planet, we share it with a lot of other people, and we need to make sure that we're using our resources as efficiently as possible. So for me, that's the big theme that seems to be coming out this year.
Thank you all. Thank you, Hazel, for the question as well. Thank you for your participation. Thank you, Matt,
Thanks,
for
Jenny.
engaging.